Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to loop through this nebulae array and use the for loop to our advantage so we can initialize some of the anim data members and make our code a lot more concise and efficient. Let's get started. So here's our code, and just above our nebulae array, here are where we initialize neb data and neb2 data. Now, if you'll notice, there's a lot of repeated code here. Take a look at neb data, and its first member is a rectangle, and we're initializing it with the same values that we're initializing neb2 data to. In fact, we're doing this with almost all of these variables. When we have repeated code like this, it's a prime opportunity to make use of for loops. So here's what we're going to do. Here's our nebulae array, and instead of passing in values here, I'm going to remove these values and just leave our curly braces empty. Instead, we're going to use a for loop to initialize some of the variables in each anim data in the nebulae array. So just under our line where we declare nebulae, we're going to create a for loop. Let's say for, and our first statement inside the parentheses is the initialization of our loop variable. This is going to be an integer. So we're going to create an int, and we're going to call this I and initialize it to 0. Add the semicolon, and now we can create our loop condition. Now, our nebulae array has only 2 elements, so I'm going to make the condition I is less than 2. Now for the third statement, which is going to be the loop update. I'm just going to use I++, so each time we iterate the loop, I will get incremented by 1. Next, we have the loop body, and this is where code will be executed each iteration of the loop. Now, each element in nebulae is an anim data, and each of these anim datas has a rectangle called rec. I'd like to assign a value to the rec variable of each anim data in nebulae. And we can access the ith element in nebulae by saying nebulae of I. Now this gives me one of the elements in nebulae, and I'd like to access its rec variable. So I'm going to use the dot operator and type rec. So now that I'm accessing the rectangle, I can use the dot operator again to access the rectangle's individual variables. Let's access the x and use the assignment operator to assign a value to it. I'm going to use 0.0 for the x. Next, I'd like to assign a value to the rectangle's y. So I'm going to say nebulae of I dot rec dot y, and we can give this a value of 0.0 as well. Next, I'd like to access the rectangle's width and give it the value of nebula.width divided by 8. So go ahead and access this rectangle's width and assign it this value. Great job. So it's going to be nebulae of I dot rec dot width, and we're going to assign it a value of nebula.width divided by 8. Now we need to assign the height. So we're going to say nebulae of I dot rec dot height equals nebula.height divided by 8. So this will initialize the rectangle that belongs to the anim data, which is the ith element of nebulae. Now we need to initialize the pos member. So we're going to access that by saying nebulae of I dot pos. And pos has an x and a y. Now we're not going to initialize the x in the for loop because notice that neb data has a different x than neb2 data. Neb2 data uses the width of the window plus 300, so the second nebula is starting 300 pixels to the right of the first nebula. We can, however, initialize the y component of the position because this is the same for each nebula hazard. So let's go ahead and access the y variable, and we'll initialize it to window dimensions of 1 minus nebula.height divided by 8. Which is the value that we assigned to the y of the pos variable in each neb data. Let's see what other variables we have to initialize. So I'm going to type nebulae of I followed by the dot operator, and now we see all of the variables that we can access. We can initialize frame, and this we need to initialize with a value of 0. Let's see what other variables we can initialize. We're going to type nebulae of I followed by the dot operator, and we have running time and update time. Let's initialize running time with a value of 0.0, and let's initialize update time with a value of 0.0 as well. So now this for loop is going to loop through each element in the nebulae array and assign values to each anim data in this array. Now, since we didn't initialize the pos.x variable, let's initialize those down here. So we'll say nebulae of 0.pos.x, and for this value, let's take a look at neb data. We initialized the pos.x variable with window dimensions of 0. Let's copy that, and just under the for loop, we'll give nebulae of 0.pos.x the value of window dimensions of 0. Now let's initialize nebulae of 1.pos.x. Looking at neb2 data, we'll see that we gave the pos.x variable a value of window dimensions of 0 plus 300. So let's go ahead and use that for nebulae of 1.pos.x. So now we've initialized the variables that belong to each anim data in the nebulae array. And now I want you to notice that since we removed neb data and neb2 data from the braces in our line where we initialized nebulae, we no longer need neb data or neb2 data. In fact, if we highlight these and delete them, we'll see that we don't create any errors in our code because we've already replaced each instance of those variables with our array indexing the first and second element, respectively. So here's your challenge. I want you to change the nebulae array to have a size of 3 instead of 2. Change the loop condition to I is less than 3 instead of I is less than 2, so that way the for loop will iterate 3 times instead of just 2. And initialize the nebulae of 2.pos.x, and we're going to use window dimensions of 0 plus 600. That way, this third nebula is going to start off 600 pixels to the right of the screen, which will be 300 pixels to the right of the second nebula. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so here's our code, and here's nebulae. We're going to change this to have a size of 3. And for our loop condition, instead of I is less than 2, we need this to be I is less than 3. Now here we're initializing the pos.x of each anim data. Let's go ahead and access nebulae of 2.pos.x, and we're going to initialize this to window dimensions of 0 plus 600. Great job. So in summary, we used a for loop to initialize the nebulae variables. We created a third anim data when we changed the size of the nebulae array. Now our for loop initialized this third element's variables for us because we changed the loop condition to loop over all 3 elements in this array. But we manually initialized the pos.x for this third element because it's different than the first and second pos.x values. In the next video, we're going to make more use of for loops so that we can update the animation data as well as the position of all 3 nebulae and see how this will allow us to create more and more nebulae for less work. I'll see you in the next video.